Hello and welcome to part 2 of week two's discussion of our material. In this brief part of our lecture this week, we will talk about how we're going to define the crisis this semester with our U.S. political institutions, and we'll discuss the readings from Yglesias, Dahl, and Edwards that set up this crisis. So if you remember from our syllabus and from the first introductory lecture, the question we're going to tackle the entire semester is this: do the American political institutions stand up to the controversies of our time? Now, to do that, we're going to do two very important things. One is that we're going to understand what each institution is supposed to do. So to do this, we're going to use the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and even the Anti-Federalist Papers, arguing that the Constitution will fail and is wrong, to give us an understanding of what the Constitution meant at the time that it was ratified. So I'm going to help fill in the gaps in our lectures with the functions, the duties, all of that kind of nuts and bolts type of thing. And then we're going to use some of our readings to frame what each institution is supposed to do. The second way in which we'll tackle that question almost is kind of the next step in any sort of process, which is, okay, if that's what is supposed to be done, is that what is being done? In other words, we have to understand how the Constitution has worked over time. How have the institutions worked over time? How are they working now? So again, this involves lecture and then our more contemporary readings, which our readings today definitely fall into that category. So let's take a dive into those readings. And the first one, which I think asks the question most bluntly and sets up the controversy for us very nicely, is Yglesias's piece, American Democracy is Doomed. And again, I know this is a very provocative, controversial title, and he's trying to make that point. So by way of background, Matt Yglesias is a more liberal writer, but one who currently works for the website Vox. He's actually a founder of Vox, Vox.com. So Yglesias is making this point that the U.S. system of government is not going to work in the long term, that there are all of these reasons why the U.S. system of government has worked until now, but that this is not a long-term solution. And in fact, we have seen, as he says, cracks in the facade that let us know that we're going to have to do something different at some point. So he has a considerable amount of evidence to give for this proposition, some of which is American and some of which is not. So he talks about things like the collection of the power in the presidency. In other words, what he talks about is immigration law and policy under Obama and how that is centralized in the hands of the president. Now, this was written in 2015. You can certainly make the argument under Trump that immigration is a focal point of presidential power and that the president has gained more power in the area of immigration than ever before. And he says that this collection of power leads some political scientists to think that the U.S. systems are not functioning well and are actually exhibiting signs of stress or transformation. He talks about the fact that other countries have tried a presidential system and have failed. So he refers to Chile, he refers to Honduras, and he gives different scenarios in which those countries have not been able to succeed, utilizing some of our kind of key features. Another key point he makes is that because Congress and the president are both elected by the people, they have kind of a dueling claim to be the representative of the people. And that leads to gridlock because you have the president saying, the people have told me to do X, and you have Congress saying, the people have told me to do Y, or trying to collectively say that, and that's when Congress can even act. So in that instance, you have the same claim being made about the same people, but in different ways. So you're going to inevitably have gridlock and a system in which things cannot get done. He talks about how in parliamentary systems you can break this gridlock because the prime minister is a member of parliament, but that does not work as well in a presidential system. And then he talks about growing political polarization. And he talks a little bit about the political science methodology of determining how political parties have diverged over time. In other words, how Democrats have become more liberal and Republicans have become more conservative, and how that has sort of solidified. I think what he starts to talk about, but probably doesn't explain quite as well, is how this is not just a function or a facet or a phenomenon in Congress. This is something that has happened in the population where people are more ideologically polarized than ever before. He says that even when we had polarization in previous eras, the politics were very different. There were different institutions, there were different norms, and those things kept people in line. So he references what one political scientist calls constitutional hardball, which means that while the things that are happening now may not violate the Constitution per se or in and of itself, they do set up the breaking of norms that have held the constitutional system together over time. And when you have enough people playing constitutional hardball, you start to see the cracks in the facade. And I think as we have moved away from Yglesias's piece, so that was 2015, moving forward into 16, 17, 18, and 19 and beyond, we start to see that maybe there is a point to be made here, right? Because we're starting to realize, I think, as a society, that so much of what we are used to government doing is not prescribed by law, but rather the norms that we have developed over time. And if people violate those norms and we're not willing to put a check on them, what does that mean for our constitutional system? So I think we're already starting to see some of this play out a little more after this piece, even though it's a very recent piece. So we are reading this because this sets up one side of our debate this semester. And the side of the debate it sets up is that the Constitution or the institutions that we have are not going to work. The next piece we have is from Dahl, and Dahl is a very famous political scientist. This is a snippet of a piece that he wrote about the Constitution as a model for other nations, or the U.S. Constitution, really, as a model for other nations. So the point that Dahl is making here is that the U.S. Constitution is a very unique document. It's very bound to the American experience and to American history, and it's probably not likely going to help anybody but Americans. He's not necessarily making the point, like Yglesias did, that the Constitution is failing, the institutions are failing, things are going to fall apart. Instead, what he's saying is, let's not fool ourselves and think that we're the model for everybody else. So the evidence he's using to support that point is really very methodical. He has a very kind of encompassing methodology that Yglesias does not have, in that he conducts an investigation or a survey, I use that term lately, of advanced democracies. And he looks at their constitutions, their institutions, and how they govern themselves. And he compares kind of the main facets of the constitutions using our framework and institutional setup to show how much of an outlier the United States is in terms of what he calls advanced democracies. And yet what he ends up showing is how things like suffrage and human rights are protected in advanced democracies that do not use our system of governance. So, in other words, what he's saying is that you do not need the U.S. Constitution to have the benefits that we believe the U.S. Constitution provides. So this is not a new side of the debate, but rather provides support for the Yglesias side of the debate in a sort of structural way by comparing the U.S. to other institutions in other countries, just to show how unique the U.S. Constitution is. Our final piece this week is from Edwards, and it's a short piece called "The Strength of American Democracy." And the main point that Edwards is making is that the U.S. system, while it may be unique, while it may be old, is flexible, and it can hear concerns well, and it makes that system uniquely strong. And so he uses some evidence to support that point. He says when people are upset in the U.S., they have nonviolent avenues to be heard. So he references the Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, and other protest movements to explain how we do not have to resort to violence to be heard in the United States. He also says that voters can and will change the direction of the nation when they feel that the work of the nation is not getting done. So he points out different elections in which he feels like that change was made and the people were heard. So he also then kind of adds in another argument, and I don't think it's a very strong one, but it is one at least worth noting for as we set up this question. So for our introductory section here, he says, while this may not be all ideal, that there might be some problems, there has not been proven anything better. So he talks about the Churchill quote saying, democracies are horrible, and except for, they're not as horrible as everything else. I'm obviously paraphrasing and butchering it in the process, but it's a Churchill quote that's actually based off of a lot of older thought going all the way back to Plato about how democracy is messy and complicated. What Edwards doesn't tend to point to is that we're not necessarily talking about democracy and the will of the people. We're talking about the republic here and the form of government in the form of the institutions. However, for purposes of our kind of structuring this debate, asking this question, this sets up the other side, which is giving us some evidence and some points for why the U.S. Constitution and the institutions found therein are strong, worthwhile, and built to last. So we now have the framework of our debate. We have on one side the U.S. system as and not ideal. This is the Yglesias and the Dahl point, meaning we are not experiencing perhaps the best we could ever experience, or at least in Dahl's case, the American Constitution is unique and only works in America. So they, when posed with the question whether the institutions are built to last the test of time, Yglesias would certainly say no. Dahl might say that it depends, but these are certainly unique to the U.S. And historically bound too. The other side is the side that says the U.S. system is strong. The flexibility built into the system is going to aid in making sure that the institutions withstand the test of time. And so Edwards sets up that counterpoint for us that will continue into the next week. So what you should get from these readings is why they were written, why we're reading them in this class, the evidence used, and then, of course, in this week in particular, this overall debate that is being set up here.